All right, welcome to another deep dive. This time we're tackling something super cool. Um, Terraform, state, and workspaces.
Uh, I gotta say, I've been playing around with Terraform for a while now. Infrastructure as code is seriously a game changer. But I feel like there's so much more to it than just the code.
Right.
It's got its own language, like providers, and this whole state thing, which, can feel a little bit mysterious sometimes. I mean, what is it really?
Yeah, state. Well, think of state like Terraform's memory, its brain.
Okay.
It's basically a snapshot of everything that Terraform's built for you in your infrastructure,
Yeah.
a record of every single resource. And here's the key. It's structured.
Oh, okay.
It's not just random nodes. It's all formatted in JSON.
Yeah.
And it's got versions, lineage resources, outputs, checks.
I've seen those JSON files before. They can get huge. Why is all that structure so important? I mean, it can't just be for a reading pleasure.
No, definitely not. Terraform actually uses that state information to figure out what's changed since the last time it ran.
So it compares your current configuration to that state and figures out, okay, what needs to be added, what needs to be updated, what can stay the same. And this is all part of Terraform's declarative approach. So instead of giving it step-by-step instructions, you describe the desired state of your infrastructure, and Terraform figures out the how.
That's a pretty big difference from tools like Ansible, which is, what I'm used to. I mean, that's all about specific commands, right?
Absolutely. With Ansible, you're basically telling it, do this, then do that, and then do this other thing, right? So it's very procedural. But with Terraform, you're giving it the blueprint.
Right.
You're saying, hey, make it look like this. And the state file, that's how Terraform keeps track of how the infrastructure has been built, according to that blueprint.
Okay, that makes sense. So if this state file is so important, where do we keep it?
Right. Good question. Well, you have options, right? You can store your state locally. Right on your computer. And that's super easy, especially for, personal projects or if you're just starting out. But if you're working in a team, that gets tricky.
Oh, yeah.
Because local state just isn't really meant for collaboration. Imagine, multiple people working on the same infrastructure, making changes. Everyone's got their own local state file.
Oh, yeah, that's going to be a mess.
It can get chaotic. So for teams, what we use are remote state backends. And that's basically where you store that state file in a shared location.
Okay.
It's accessible to everyone on the team. So think, AWS S3, Terraform Cloud, even, self-hosted solutions. It's like having that single source of truth for your infrastructure, kind of like a file system where you can think of workspaces as files.
So like Google Docs for infrastructure.
Right.
Everyone can edit at the same time.
Not quite. And that actually brings us to another important concept, which is state locking.
Okay.
Because even with a shared state, you don't want multiple people making changes simultaneously.
No, that would be bad.
Yeah, that could really mess things up.
Yeah.
So state locking is like having a traffic light.
Okay.
It makes sure only one operation can modify the state at any given time. And this is where, DynamoDB and AWS can come in handy. It's super fast and reliable for state locking.
Okay. State locking, no infrastructure, traffic jams. I like it. But what about those times when we want to, test things out without messing up our live environment?
You're talking about different environments, right?
Right.
Dev, staging, production. This is where Terraform Workspaces really shine.
Okay.
It's like having these parallel universes for your infrastructure. You can deploy the same code base, but with variations for each environment, and they're all completely isolated from each other.
Parallel universes. Now you're talking my language. Tell me more.
Right. It's pretty cool. So you can have like a dev workspace where you're trying out risky configurations.
Okay.
But then your prod workspace, that stays stable and safe. And each of these workspaces, it gets its own state file. So you can experiment without the fear of, accidentally breaking production.
So we can break things in dev and be okay.
Exactly.
Okay, that sounds good to me.
Right. It's a really powerful way to manage those different environments.
All right, so I think I'm starting to get the hang of this.
Yeah.
So Terraform state. It's like the brains of the operation, keeping track of everything.
Yeah.
And we've got options for storing it. Local files for simple stuff or remote backends for when we need to collaborate.
Exactly.
And state locking, that's our traffic light to prevent any infrastructure collisions.
Exactly.
And then workspaces. That's where things get really interesting.
Yeah, it's like stepping into the multiverse. There's so much we can do with workspaces, different strategies for managing them, best practices for naming conventions, how to handle more complex scenarios.
Sounds like we've got a lot more to explore. But maybe it's a good time to take a quick break and let this all sink in before we jump into those parallel universes.
Sounds good. Let's pick it up in part 2. Workspaces are definitely a game changer. So much flexibility, managing those different environments.
They are. But I can't help but think, like, if we have a ton of workspaces, maybe one for each feature branch, won't that become like a tangled mess? How do we keep things organized?
Yeah, you need a good strategy for that.
Hmm.
Planning and naming conventions are key here. You've got to think about your team's workflow, how complex your project is, that kind of thing.
So there's no like one-size-fits-all approach, huh?
No, not really. For a small team working on one project, it might be simple.
Okay.
A workspace for dev, one for staging, one for production, that kind of thing.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about larger organizations with like multiple teams and tons of projects?
Things can get more complicated there. They might need a more granular approach,
Okay.
maybe a separate workspace for every feature branch.
Mm.
It gives you more isolation, lets people work in parallel, but it also requires more discipline.
More discipline. How so?
Well, you got to be really careful about merging changes, making sure your workspaces match up with your version control system. Speaking of which, how do you guys manage your infrastructure code? Git, I
Oh
assume.
yeah, get all the way. Our trusty time machine for code. Why?
Well, a lot of folks like to mirror their Git branching model with their Terraform workspaces.
Oh, okay.
So if you've got a feature branch in Git, you make a matching workspace in Terraform.
I see.
When you merge that feature branch back into main in Git, you also merge the Terraform workspace changes.
So it's all about keeping things in sync. But wouldn't that, like, perfectly mirroring branches and workspaces, would that lead to a massive amount of workspaces, especially in a large team?
That's true. You can definitely end up with workspace sprawl if you're not careful. There are ways to manage that, though, like temporary workspaces for short-lived features and making sure to delete workspaces you don't need anymore.
Yeah, cleanup is important. All right, can we walk through a real-world example of how these workspaces work in action?
Sure, let's say you're adding a new feature to your e-commerce platform, like a recommendation engine.
Okay.
Now, you don't want to mess with the live site while you're working on this, right? So you'd create a feature branch in Git, let's call it recommendation engine.
Got it.
Yeah.
And then following that mirror strategy, we'd make a corresponding Terraform workspace, maybe feature recommendation engine.
Exactly. Now you've got this isolated space to build all the infrastructure for your recommendation engine.
Boy.
Maybe a new database cluster, some machine learning model, some API endpoints.
All without affecting the production environment.
Precisely. And because it's a separate workspace, you can experiment, tweak configurations, test it all out before it goes live. Once it's ready, you merge your feature branch back into main in Git and then merge those Terraform workspace changes into your production workspace.
And boom, production gets the shiny new infrastructure for the recommendation engine. That's slick. But what about when you need to make a quick fix in production? Do we create a whole new branch and workspace for a tiny hot fix?
You don't necessarily need to. For small, isolated fixes, you can just make the changes directly in your production workspace. But remember, always run Terraform plan first to see what those changes are going to do before you actually apply anything.
Right, safety first. We don't want to accidentally break production because of a typo.
Exactly. Terraform's got your back with that plan and apply workflow. And workspaces give you that control and isolation you need, whether it's a big feature rollout or a tiny hot fix.
Man, workspaces are powerful. It's like we're taking control of our infrastructure destiny.
It's one of the great things about Terraform. But remember, all this power comes with responsibility.
Right.
You need that discipline and a solid workflow. Think about your workspace strategy, your branching, your naming conventions, and documentation. Don't forget the documentation.
Oh yeah, documentation is key, like a map for your infrastructure. Speaking of maps, we've covered a lot of ground today. We started with what Terraform State is all about, how it's structured. Then we ventured into remote state backends, state locking, and then dove deep into workspaces with all their possibilities.
Oh, their complexities.
We even squeezed in a real-world example and touched on the importance of workflow and documentation.
It's been quite a journey, but we're not done yet. There's still so much more to explore with Terraform.
Like what? Nope. Don't leave me hanging.
Oh.
Okay, lay it on me. What other Terraform secrets are we going to uncover today?
Well, let's think bigger picture for a second. You've got your workspaces all organized, state files are safe and sound, but what happens when you have multiple Terraform projects? How do they all work together?
That's a good point. I mean, our infrastructure is not usually just one project.
Right?
I might have a project for networking, another for applications, maybe a separate one for security.
Exactly. And sometimes those projects need to, talk to each other, share information,
Right.
and that's where remote state data sources come in. It's like building a bridge between your different Terraform projects so they can access each other's state information.
So instead of like hard coding values or manually copying things between projects, we can just pull the data directly from the state file.
Exactly.
Hmm.
So much more efficient, way less room for error.
Right.
So, let's say your application deployment project needs the ID of your VPC, but that VPC is managed in a totally separate networking project.
Okay.
You can use a remote state data source to just grab that ID straight from the networking project state.
So we're basically building these data pipelines between our Terraform projects.
Yeah, think of it that way. Keeping everything in sync, no manual work. I like it. But this also sounds like it could get pretty complex if we're not careful.
Well, complexity is always a challenge when it comes to infrastructure. And the more our infrastructure grows, the more important collaboration becomes. So how do you guys usually handle collaboration in your team?
Well, Git is our lifeline.
Version control for everything. Code, infrastructure, you name it. We've got a good branching strategy, code reviews, all that jazz.
Solid foundation.
Yeah.
Have you looked into tools like Terraform Cloud or Atlantis? They can really supercharge your collaboration.
Oh, okay.
They've got features for automated planning and applying, role-based access control, detailed audit logs, everything's all in one place.
So it's not just about writing the code anymore. It's about having a whole platform to manage the entire life cycle of that infrastructure as code.
Right.
And of course, the human element communication, sharing knowledge, those code reviews. Can't forget those.
Couldn't agree more. Tools can help, but it's the people and the processes that really make collaboration work.
So true. Looking ahead, what are some of the big trends, challenges you see coming up in the world of infrastructure as code? This field moves so fast, it feels like there's always something new on the horizon.
Oh, definitely. It's a fast-paced world. One thing that's really taking off is serverless computing and managed services.
Oh, yeah.
We're relying more and more on those cloud providers to handle that underlying infrastructure so we can focus on the applications.
That sounds great in theory, but doesn't that make managing infrastructure as code harder? I mean, we're dealing with a more abstract layer now, further away from the actual hardware.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mindset shift. But Terraform's evolving. There are new providers popping up all the time to support those serverless technologies. And tools are getting better at handling those complex deployments.
So Terraform's keeping up with the times.
It is.
Good to know. Anything else we should be keeping our eyes on?
Well, security and compliance are huge.
Yeah.
Infrastructure as code can actually play a big role in automating security policies, making sure we're meeting those compliance standards and catching vulnerabilities early on.
So it's not just about building infrastructure. It's about building it securely.
Exactly. Especially these days.
Well, folks, we've reached the end of our deep dive into Terraform state and workspaces. We've covered a lot of ground, from the basics of state files to the collaborative power of remote backends and the incredible flexibility of workspaces.
We talked about different ways to manage those workspaces, the importance of collaboration and the right tools, and even peeked into the future of infrastructure as code.
This has been a fantastic journey. I feel like I've got a whole new understanding of Terraform now.
But the learning never ends. Keep experimenting, keep exploring those new features, and keep sharing what you learn.
And remember, building infrastructure is a team sport. Work together, learn from each other.
And together we can master that art of infrastructure as code.
Until next time, happy terraforming.